Hello. In the first part of this examination of the book Anarcho-Syndicalism by Rudolf Rocker, we covered the first half of the book, in which Rocker gives a rough overview of the thoroughly intertwined histories of the left, the labor movement, socialism, radical unionism, and anarchism. In this second half of the book, Rocker talks about revolutionary syndicalism in France, and how this led to modern anarcho-syndicalism. Then Rocker describes what anarcho-syndicalism is, first by talking about its goals, then talking about its tactics. And finally, Rocker brings his history up to what was for him the modern day, by talking about the Second and Third Internationals, revolutionary Spain, various ansyn movements around the world, and where anarcho-syndicalism stood at the beginning of the post-war period. Let's begin where we left off, at the start of Chapter 4, The Objectives of Anarcho-Syndicalism. Modern anarcho-syndicalism is a direct continuation of those aspirations which took shape in the First International, and which were best understood and most strongly held by the libertarian wing of the Great Workers' Alliance. It stands in direct opposition to the political socialism of our day, represented by the parliamentary labor parties in the different countries. Rocker points out that the creation of new political parties by folks associated with the labor movement was rare before the International, and he also points out that enough time has gone by that we can evaluate the results of the parliamentary reform tactics enforced on the International by Marx and Engels. Today we are in a position to estimate the results of their tactics for socialism and the labor movement after more than 60 years' activity in all countries. And of course, it's been a further 80 years since Rocker wrote that, so we in the present are in an even better position to evaluate the parliamentary reform experiment. I think Rocker's estimation holds true to this day. Participation in the politics of the states has not brought the labor movement a hair's breadth closer to socialism. But thanks to this method, socialism has almost been completely crushed and condemned to insignificance. The ancient proverb, "Who eats of the Pope does of him," has held true in this content also. Who eats of the state is ruined by it. Participation in parliamentary politics has affected the socialist labor movement like an insidious poison. It destroyed the belief in the necessity of constructive socialist activity, and worst of all, the impulse to self-help, by inoculating people with the ruinous delusion that salvation always comes from above. Thus, in place of the creative socialism of the old International, there developed a sort of substitute product, which has nothing in common with real socialism but the name. Socialism steadily lost its character of a cultural ideal, which was to prepare the people for the dissolution of capitalist society, and therefore could not let itself be halted by the artificial frontiers of the nation-states. I think Rocker is completely correct when he says that the idea that socialism can come from above crippled the labor movement's ability to organize. This is what happens when you de-emphasize the role of the people in getting things done for themselves, or as Rocker calls it, the impulse to self-help. It is even truer today than it was at time of publication, that modern socialism is to a large extent just the name being slapped onto something else. And Rocker also drops a truth bomb in the last thing he says here, that socialism and nationalism do not mix well. Socialism is about cooperation. Nationalism is about us versus them. When you try to affix socialism to a nationalist apparatus like that of a nation-state, it's going to go badly. These very parties, which had once set out to conquer political power under the flag of socialism, saw themselves compelled by the iron logic of conditions to sacrifice their socialist convictions bit by bit to the national policies of the state. They became, without the majority of their adherents ever becoming aware of it, political lightning rods for the security of the capitalist social order. The political power which they had wanted to conquer had gradually conquered their socialism, until there was scarcely anything left of it. And I mean, again, this is something that's even truer now than it was when Rocker wrote it. And you just have to look at the Third Way's takeover of the Labour parties in countries like the UK and New Zealand back in the 90s for evidence of this. And I mean, sure, since then, in recent years, progressives have taken back control of those parties from the Third Way.
I've been a trade unionist all my life, and I'm very proud to say I will die a trade unionist.
but the mere fact that centrists could take over the Labour parties to begin with is a really bad sign, and it's indicative of the nature of political parties. Rocker then talks about the different ways in which formerly socialist political parties lost their socialism. Parliamentarianism, which quickly attained a dominating position in the Labour parties of the different countries, lured a lot of bourgeois minds and career-hungry politicians into the socialist camp, and this helped to accelerate the internal decay of original socialist principles. Thus, socialism in the course of time lost its creative initiative and became an ordinary reform movement which lacked any element of greatness. People were content with successes at the polls, and no longer attributed any importance to social upbuilding and constructive education of the workers for this end. Rocker makes a really good point here, that political parties attract those who are hungry for power and those who were born into already having it, the wealthy, the greedy, and the authoritarian. In Russia, the seizure of power by the left wing of state socialism in the form of Bolshevism paved the way not for a socialist society, but for the most primitive type of bureaucratic state capitalism. In Germany, however, where the moderate wing in the form of social democracy attained power, socialism in its long years of absorption in routine parliamentary tasks had become so bogged down that it was no longer capable of any creative act whatsoever. With these three quotes, we can see Rocker's diagnosis of the socialist parliamentary project. Each quote represents one of the three different ways it can go when one creates a socialist political party. 1. You slowly revert to liberalism. 2. You capture the state apparatus and become the new ruling elite. 3. You remain socialist but are consistently outmaneuvered by liberals, who know how to use the parliamentary system better than you do, as it is their system. In Rocker's time, the third option was common, but is now less so, as many of the parties in that camp have since shifted to the first one. In fact, the entire ideology of social democracy that Rocker refers to is now synonymous with liberalism. There was a time when social democrats were socialists, but now those advocating for social democracy are what used to be called social liberals, and are also referred to as progressive liberals, i.e., those seeking to use parliamentary reform and state power to try and improve society within a capitalist framework. Now Rocker turns to French revolutionary syndicalism, which was the forerunner to modern anarcho-syndicalism. The term workers' syndicate meant in France merely a trade union organization of producers, but the rise of revolutionary syndicalism gave this original meaning a much wider and deeper import. The French term for trade union is syndicate, so you can see why revolutionary syndicalism was called that, given that it was about using trade unions for revolutionary activity. Roughly speaking, the same basic idea presented by the Belgian Federation to the First International at the Congress in Basel in 1869. Just as the party is, so to speak, the unified organization for definite political effort within the modern constitutional state, and seeks to maintain the bourgeois order in one form or another, so, according to the syndicalist view, the trade union, the syndicate, is the unified organization of labor, and has for its purpose the defense of the interests of the producers within existing society, and the preparing for and the practical carrying out of the reconstruction of social life after the pattern of socialism. It has therefore a double purpose. 1. As the fighting organization of the workers against the employers to enforce the demands of the workers for the safeguarding and raising of their standard of living. 2. As the school for the intellectual training of the workers to make them acquainted with the technical management of production and economic life in general, so that when a revolutionary situation arises, they will be capable of taking the socio-economic organism into their own hands and remaking it according to socialist principles. Anarcho-syndicalists are of the opinion that political parties, even when they bear a socialist name, are not fitted to perform either of these two tasks. The mere fact that even in those countries where political socialism commanded powerful organizations and had millions of voters behind it, the workers had never been able to dispense with trade unions because legislation offered them no protection in their struggle for daily bread, testifies to this. Liberals think of the state legislative system as the means by which rights are secured and protected. But is that really the case? There are many different ways to look at this question, but let's just stick to class issues here, since that is the most pertinent to this video. When the labor movement sought to make sure that having weekends off became the norm for workers, it did seek to create legislation around that, but it wouldn't have been able to get that done without the trade unions. Workers simply contacting representatives and individually pleading their case would never have been enough and never was. That kind of shift in society's norms, and the level to which the employer class was against it, meant that it was a monumental task to accomplish. That's why it took strike actions, because the intention of those is to cause the employer class to become the ones contacting their representatives and pleading the workers' case. The only way to get the employers to do that, of course, is to force their hand, and their pleas are a lot more compelling to the political elites than the pleas of the lowly workers. That's how it has been since the formation of the modern state, and that's how it remains to this day.
Hello, Pittsburgh. Rocker, let me thank you for your time. You work a 40-hour week for a living, just to send it on down the line.
And then we get to the other side of the coin of why workers need trade unions, because the work of protecting rights is far from over with the passage of new laws to that end. These kinds of laws go against the interests of the powerful, and therefore the natural inclination of the state will be to enforce them in a very lax manner, or not at all. The unions must keep up the pressure relentlessly, and to make sure the state actually carries out these things, and does what it said it would do. At every level and at every stage of the struggle for workers' rights, the trade unions are a necessity for getting things done and staying done. As Rocker says, governments and parliaments seldom decide on economic or social reforms on their own initiative. So if progressive policies are going to be adopted, the initiative must be taken by others. The question then becomes, what method should be used to influence the elites to undertake reform? The anarcho-syndicalist response is to ask another question back. What works best? As I have shown, Rocker's answer to that is trade unions. And since, as I mentioned in the last video, anarcho-syndicalism is at its core an ideology of pragmatism, it follows then that the lancet of the labor movement is therefore not the political party, but the trade union, toughened by daily combat and permeated by socialist spirit. Unfortunately, most unions are a lot less socialist now than they were in the 1910s, 20s, or 30s, but I think there are two important points that need to be made regarding that. Firstly, the other elements of trade unions that are valued highly by anarcho-syndicalists are all still there. Solidarity, strength in numbers, strikes, worker education, taking the lead in various kinds of mass protest movements, favoring progressive candidates in elections, direct democracy, all that good stuff.
Because I know that we're strong, we're united, and that's what it's all about.
And what this means is that socialism, the idea that the workers should control the means of production themselves, is not a hard sell really, as it is just the next logical step. And my second point follows from this. Because all these leftist ideas permeate unionism to this day, they tend to be among the first to adopt more socialist ideas when such ideas begin to increase in popularity. You can see that happening right now. In response to the resurgence of the far right, the far left is also mobilizing across the West, and has been doing so for several years now. Socialism and radical unionism are both becoming increasingly popular, and most importantly for my point, socialism is gaining momentum within the unions as a viable goal to strive for. So, while socialism is less popular within the unions now than it was in Rocker's time, and prior to that, that is changing, and I believe it will keep changing. More and more people are seeing the economic and social power the unions can wield, and how difficult it is for the elites to break union strength when it is backed up by enough workers, and those workers are organized and energized by solidarity and the pursuit of liberty. As Rocker puts it, the worker creates in the trade union the invincible phalanx which can withstand any assault if it is aflame with the spirit of freedom and animated by the ideal of social justice. For the anarcho-syndicalists, the trade union is by no means a mere transitory phenomenon bound up with the duration of capitalist society. It is the germ of the socialist society of the future, the elementary school of socialism in general. Every new social structure makes organs for itself in the body of the old organism. One thing I really like about Marx's writings is what he says about how systems of new societies have their roots in systems that existed in the society that was replaced. Incidentally, my comrade Anarcho-Pack has a very good video about that, link in the description. It therefore concerns us to plant these germs while there is still yet time and bring them to the strongest possible development, so as to make the task of the coming social revolution easier and to ensure its permanence. Whatever systems are going to guide society through a transition into a new phase of being will, by necessity, be systems that also existed during at least the later parts of the society that is to be replaced. Once you understand that fact, you realize that a choice needs to be made as to which system or systems you think are most fit for that purpose. Anarcho-syndicalism argues that trade unions are best for two reasons. Firstly, because they have all the necessary features a system would need to create an anarchist society that is industrious enough to survive against hostile capitalist nations. States. More on that later. And secondly, because these organizations are already well established and represent large numbers of workers, so they are also a pragmatic choice as well. But if a currently existing system is going to be the vehicle by which socialism is achieved, then that system will have to be very effective at educating the workers. And by educating, I don't mean brainwashing them to think whatever you think. I mean really educating them in independent thought. All the educational work of the anarcho-syndicalist is aimed at this purpose. Education for socialism does not mean for them trivial campaign propaganda and so-called politics of the day, but the effort to make clear to the workers the intrinsic connections among social problems by technical instruction. what we in the modern day might call intersectional activist training, how to think big and think deep when it comes to tackling social issues, how to see the broader underlying causes, what the various ideas for solutions are. It's what Chomsky has called a course in intellectual self-defense.
I feel that I'm simply helping people develop courses of intellectual self-defense.
What did you mean by that? What would such a course be?
I don't mean go to school, because they're not going to get it there. It means you have to develop an independent mind and work on it.
A body of workers who cannot think for themselves cannot become organized enough to secure for themselves the means of production. Anarcho-syndicalists argue that the trade unions offer the best mechanism by which to spread this kind of radical education around, and we present as evidence how effectively socialist ideas were spread around the trade unions by the educational work of the Spanish anarcho-syndicalists prior to the Spanish Revolution, which Rocker is about to get to. The following is one of the longest uninterrupted excerpts from the book that I am going to present, because everything Rocker says here is on point, and just had to be included in a video like this. Because the educational work of the anarcho-syndicalists is directed toward the development of independent thought and action, they are outspoken opponents of all those centralizing tendencies which are so characteristic of all political labor parties. But centralism, that artificial organization from above, which turns over the affairs of everybody in a lump to a small minority, is always attended by barren official routine. And this crushes individual conviction, kills all personal initiative by lifeless discipline and bureaucratic ossification, and permits no independent action. The organization of anarcho-syndicalism is based on the principles of federalism, on free combination from below upward, putting the right of self-determination of every member above everything else, and recognizing only the organic agreement of all on the basis of like interests and common convictions. It has often been charged against federalism that it divides the forces and cripples the strength of organized resistance, and very significantly, it has been just the representatives of the political labor parties and of the trade unions under their influence who have kept repeating this charge to the point of nausea. But here too, the facts of life have spoken more clearly than any theory. There was no country in the world where the whole labor movement was so completely centralized and the technique of organization developed to such extreme perfection as in Germany before Hitler's accession to power. A powerful bureaucratic apparatus covered the whole country and determined every political and economic expression of the organized workers. In the very last elections, the Social Democratic and Communist parties united over 12 million voters for their candidates. But after Hitler seized power, 6 million organized workers did not raise a finger to avert the catastrophe which had plunged Germany into the abyss, and which in a few months beat their organization completely to pieces. But in Spain, where anarcho-syndicalism had maintained its hold upon organized labor from the days of the First International, and by untiring libertarian education and sharp fighting had trained it to resistance, it was the powerful CNT which by the boldness of its action frustrated the criminal plans of Franco and his numerous helpers at home and abroad, and by their heroic example spurred the Spanish workers and peasants to the battle against fascism, a fact which Franco himself has been compelled to acknowledge. Without the heroic resistance of the anarcho-syndicalist labor unions, the fascist reactionaries would in a few weeks have dominated the whole country. Now, of course, Franco did go on to win the war after this book was first published, and Rocker provides his thoughts on this in the epilogue that was added later, but his point still stands. Rocker compares the efforts of the Spanish social anarchist trade unions in fighting fascists in their country to that of the German state socialist political parties doing the same thing. He correctly describes how the German socialist parties, with their centralized top-down structure, were completely smashed to pieces in a matter of weeks, and how much better the Spanish anarchist trade unions performed. The Spanish anarchists were able to organize 1.5 million workers and seize the means of production in Catalonia, then go on to immediately fight an existential war against Nazi-backed fascists with basically zero international support. The fact that they were able to put up the level of resistance they did is a testament to their fighting spirit and the effectiveness of their ideas and organizational capabilities. And organizational capability is absolutely key, as we will discuss throughout this chapter and the next. One of the reasons organizational capability matters so much is that a worker-based movement often needs to be able to act really quickly and decisively in response to actions taken by the state or by capitalists. For a movement whose very existence depends on prompt action at any favorable moment and on the independent thought and action of its supporters, centralism could be but a curse by weakening its power of decision and systematically repressing all immediate action. If, for example, as was the case in Germany, every local strike had first to be approved by the central, which was often hundreds of miles away and was usually not in a position to pass a correct judgment on the local conditions, one cannot wonder that the inertia of the apparatus of central organization renders a quick attack quite impossible. Rocker then describes how anarcho-syndicalists prefer to organize trade unions in a pre-revolutionary society like ours. Their organization is constructed on the following principles. The workers in each locality join the unions of their respective trades, and these are subject to the veto of no central, but enjoy the entire right of self-determination. The trade unions of a city or rural district combine in a so-called labor cartel. The labor cartels constitute the centers for local radical education. They weld the workers together as a class. In times of local labor trouble, they arrange for the solidaric cooperation of the whole body of organized labor and the use of every agency available under the circumstances. All the labor cartels are grouped according to districts and regions to form the National Federation of Labor Cartels, which maintain the permanent connection between the local bodies, arranges for free adjustment of the productive labor of the members of the different organization on cooperative lines, provides for the necessary cooperation in the field of education, in which the stronger cartels will need to come to the aid of the weaker ones, and in general support the local groups with counsel and guidance. Every trade union is, moreover, federatively aligned with all the same organizations in the same trade throughout the country, and these in turn with all the related trades, so that all are combined in general industrial alliances. It is the task of these alliances to arrange for the cooperative action of the local groups, to conduct solidaric strikes where the necessity arises, and to meet all the demands of the day-to-day struggle between capital and labor. Thus, the Federation of Labor Cartels and the Federation of Industrial Alliances constitute the two poles around which the whole life of the trade unions revolves. Though I haven't worked much in it since I injured my back in mid-2015, I work in the film industry in Wellington, New Zealand. In the film industry, we have trade unions, but we call them guilds. The guilds are organized along job category lines. If you work on film sets in a technical role, you'll be in the Techos Guild. If you're a director or an editor, you'd be in the Directors and Editors Guild, writers in the Writers Guild, etc. All the guilds are centralized, with most if not all of them having their national headquarters located in the largest city in the country, Auckland. And if we take the Writers Guild as an example, decisions are made through a board of executives located in Auckland. The board is headed up by an executive director. Now, let's compare this structure to what it might look like if organized along syndicalist lines. Rather than being in a nationwide union according to my job type that is headquartered in a different city, I'd be in the Wellington Film Industry Union, which would in turn be part of three wider organizations: a federation of local film industry unions from around New Zealand, a wider federation of unions from other branches of the creative arts, and a labor cartel of workers in every industry in Wellington City. Each of those organizations would in turn be federalized members of even broader organizations. The Federation of Film Industry Unions and the Federation of Unions in the Creative Arts would be members of the New Zealand Federation of Industrial Alliances, and the Wellington Labor Cartel would be a member of the New Zealand Federation of Labor Cartels. The reason we think unions should be organized this way is that it is only by doing so that the full economic and social power of the workers as a class can be wielded effectively. We'll be talking about precisely how that works later on. Now Rocker moves on to describe how such a structure is not only the best way to organize the labor movement within a pre-revolutionary society, it is also the best way to organize a revolution itself, and the society that would arise afterward. It's all three things in one. Such a form of organization not only gives the workers every opportunity for direct action in their struggles for daily bread, it also provides them with the necessary preliminaries for carrying through the reorganization of social life on a socialist plan. Anarcho-syndicalists are convinced that a socialist economic order cannot be created by the decrees and statutes of a government, but only by the solidaric collaboration of the workers with hand or brain in each special branch of production. That is, through the taking over of the management of all plants by the producers themselves, under such form that the separate groups, plants, and branches of industry are independent members of the general economic organism, and systematically carrying on production and the distribution of the products in the interest of the community and on the basis of free mutual agreements. In such a case, the labor cartels would take over the existing social capital in each community, determine the needs of the inhabitants of their districts, and organize local consumption. Through the agency of the National Federation of Labor Cartels, it would be possible to calculate the total requirements of the country and adjust the work of production accordingly. On the other hand, it would be the task of the industrial alliances to take control of all the instruments of production, machines, raw materials, means of transportation and the like, to provide the separate producing groups with what they need. In a word, 1. Organization of the plants by the producers themselves and the direction of the work by the labor councils elected by them. 2. Organization of the total production of the country by the industrial and agricultural alliances. 3. Organization of consumption by the labor cartels. Just one quick note. I think the use of the word direction there is another probable translation quirk, because the word facilitation is more accurate. For me, the word direction implies a level of power they don't actually have. Like I said in the previous video, the people elected within anarcho-syndicalism are functionaries. Their job is to enact things decided through direct democracy, not to make decisions. Anyway, moving on. The industrial alliances determine and create the supply, and the labor cartels determine and fulfill the demand. So, in an ansyn version of New Zealand, every worker would be a member of a syndicate within their chosen field of work, whether they're actively working or not, even if they're retired. The syndicates obtain and provide the resources needed by its members to facilitate their work. So, if you're an electrician, for example, your syndicate provides you with the tools of your trade, and if something breaks or is lost or otherwise no longer usable, you get a replacement from the syndicate. It is the syndicate's job to make sure all its members have access to the resources they need to do their work. Exactly what those resources are can be decided by the syndicates through direct democracy, discussion panels, and consultation with experts. For example, what kind of safety equipment electricians must have access to in order to safely carry out their jobs. This function would be carried out by the Wellington Film Industry Syndicate as well. There are a number of quite dangerous jobs on film sets, and the industry safety rules around those would have to be carefully considered. Syndicate members would listen to panels of stunt performers discuss the issues. They'd see external safety experts come in and consult with the syndicate. And they'd vote. And after the vote, the syndicate might poll the stunt performers to see if they are happy with what the safety rules are and how they are being implemented. And if they're not, then another vote might be called. The Wellington Film Industry Syndicate would also be the apparatus by which it was decided what film productions were going to be undertaken in Wellington. And again, the specifics can vary. The syndicate in Wellington might decide on a significantly different selection process than the syndicate in Auckland or Christchurch. The way the Wellington Film Industry Syndicate would fulfill each of these roles is by its membership in both the Wellington Labor Cartel and the Federation of Film Industry Syndicates. It would report to the Labor Cartel the needs of its members that cannot be met through the syndicate directly, i.e. that require goods and services covered by Wellington's other industries. Anything that cannot be sourced within Wellington would be obtained through the New Zealand Federation of Labor Cartels. Through the Federation of Film Industry Syndicates, the Wellington Film Industry Syndicate would assess how many film productions were being undertaken around the rest of the country, and what kind of films and shows were being made, and potentially adjust Wellington's output accordingly. Also through the Federation of Film Industry Syndicates, the syndicates can organize co-productions with each other, combining resources to undertake a larger scale production than any one region could achieve on their own. The anarcho-syndicalist trade unions of Spain, and especially of Catalonia where their influence is strongest, have shown us an example in this respect which is unique in the history of the socialist labour movement. In this, they have only confirmed what the revolutionary unionists have always insisted on, that the approach to socialism is possible only when the workers have created the necessary organism for it, and when above all they have previously prepared for it by a genuinely socialistic education and direct action. Therefore, the CNT is not simply an alliance of industrial workers like the trade unions in every other country. It embraces within its ranks also the grassroots organizations of the peasant and field workers, as well as those of the brain workers and the intellectuals. If the Spanish peasants are now fighting shoulder to shoulder with city workers against fascism, it is the result of the great work of socialist education which has been performed by the CNT and its forerunners. In an extensive footnote, Rocker provides a series of quotes about the Spanish anarchists. The first is from Andreas Altmares, a professor at the University of Geneva. In the midst of the Civil War, the anarchists have proved themselves to be political organizers of the first rank. They kindled in everyone the required sense of responsibility, and knew how, by eloquent appeals, to keep alive the spirit of sacrifice for the general welfare of the people. As a social democrat, I speak here with inner joy and sincere admiration of my experiences in Catalonia. The anti-capitalist transformation took place here without their having to resort to a dictatorship. The members of the syndicates are their own masters, and carry on the production and the distribution of the products of labor under their own management, with the advice of technical experts in whom they have confidence. The enthusiasm of the workers is so great that they scorn any personal advantage and are concerned only for the welfare of all. The next quote is from Italian anti-fascist Carlo Roselli, who had been professor of economics at the University of Genoa prior to the rise of Mussolini. In 3 months, Catalonia has been able to set up a new social order in the ruins of an ancient system. This is chiefly due to the anarchists, who have revealed a quite remarkable sense of proportion, realistic understanding, and organizing ability. All the revolutionary forces of Catalonia have united in a program of syndicalist socialist character, socialization of large industry, recognition of the small proprietor, workers' control. Anarcho-syndicalism, hitherto so despised, has revealed itself as a great constructive force. I am not an anarchist, but I regard it as my duty to express here my opinion of the anarchists of Catalonia, who have all too often been represented to the world as a destructive, if not criminal, element. I was with them at the front, in the trenches, and I have learned to admire them. The Catalonian anarchists belong to the advance guard of the coming revolution. A new world was born with them, and it is a joy to serve that world. There is also a third quote along similar lines, but it is quite long, and I think the point is well made by the first two. Rocker then continues his own analysis of the Spanish anarchists. Workers, peasants, technicians, and men of science had come together for cooperative work, and in 3 months gave an entirely new character to the whole economic life of Catalonia. Each community presents a type by itself, and adjusts its internal affairs in its own way, but settles its economic questions through the agency of its federation. Thus there is preserved the possibility of free enterprise, inciting new ideas and mutual intellectual and creative stimulation. But the workers' syndicates have made their most astounding achievements in the field of industry, since they took into their hands the administration of industrial life as a whole. In Catalonia, in the course of a year, the railroads were fitted out with a complete modern equipment, and in punctuality the service reached a point that had been hitherto unknown. The same advances were achieved in the entire transport system, in the textile industry, in machine construction, in building, and in the small industries. But in the war industries, the syndicates have been a genuine miracle. By the so-called Neutrality Pact, the Spanish government was prevented from importing from abroad any considerable amount of war materials. Catalonia, before the fascist revolt, had not a single plant for the manufacture of army equipment. The first concern, therefore, was to remake whole industries to meet the war demands. A hard task for the syndicates, which already had in their hands full setting up of a new social order, but they performed it with an energy and a technical efficiency that can be explained only by the workers and their boundless readiness to make sacrifices for their cause. Rocker also mentions that the anarchists had 283 huge plants which were operating day and night for the production of war material, and that they were keeping 120,000 militia troops supplied along the front with the fascists. He continues, "Above all, they have proved that the workers, even without the capitalists, were able to carry on production and do it better than a lot of profit-hungry entrepreneurs. Whatever the outcome of the bloody war in Spain may be, to have given this great demonstration remains the indisputable service of the Spanish anarcho-syndicalists, whose heroic example has opened for the socialist movement new outlooks for the future." I mentioned earlier that one of the key reasons anarcho-syndicalism is centered around unions is that we believe they have all the necessary features a system needs to create an anarchist society which is industrious enough to survive against hostile capitalist nation-states. This is very important because the ability to compete with capitalist nations is central to the purpose of anarcho-syndicalism. In the previous video, I talked a bit about how syndicalism is usually viewed by Sindies as a temporary, transitory system. The reason we think such a transitional system is necessary is that presumably any new anarchist society is going to be surrounded by capitalist nation-states, which will most likely be hostile. And as I have emphasized repeatedly in this series, ansyn is all about pragmatism, being practical and realistic, which includes thinking about how an anarchist society is going to survive while surrounded by hostile states. Obviously, one of the solutions to this problem is to encourage and support anarchist uprisings in these neighboring nations. But anarcho-syndicalists argue that the most effective and most crucial way to not be overrun and destroyed is to focus on being as industrious as possible, especially when it comes to infrastructure, energy, and military hardware, both as a deterrent against invasion and as a preparation for it. So anarcho-syndicalism is, simply put, a way to have a society that is both truly anarchist and highly industrious at the same time. The Spanish anarcho-syndicalists lost their war against the fascists in the end, which I will be talking about later in the video, but Rocker's point here is still valid regardless of that. What struck most people who spent time among them is how highly organized they were, without having to resort to authoritarianism to achieve it. Both these quotes I showed before highlight how good the anarcho-syndicalists were at organizing. Rocker argues that their industrial output kept pace with what capitalism was capable of producing, but without the coercion, That's remarkable, and it is down to the theory being centered around making this possible. The reason the Spanish anarcho-syndicalists are so important is that they took that theory and they showed that it can be successfully put into practice. They were doing this long before the revolution itself by instituting that network of trade union federations Rocker talked about before, spreading socialist education, preparing the workers for revolutionary activity, making it possible for them to survive through long and difficult general strikes, giving them ideas for how to create various kinds of horizontally structured industrial operations, and finally carrying out the revolution itself and using the trade unions to seize the means of production from the capitalists and the state. Everything those mostly French syndicalist theorists wrote about. It worked. Those Catalonian Syndies proved that, and that is incredibly significant. Next, Rocker talks about how anarchism rejects uniformity and acknowledges that different regions and cultures have their own non-harmful traditions and unique aspects. The great superiority of federalism is, indeed, just that it takes these important matters into account, and does not insist on a uniformity that does violence to free thought, and forces on people from without things contrary to their inner inclinations. And because only a federalized system can truly account for this lack of uniformity, the current centralized political system cannot be the mechanism to create a society that rejects the forcing of a centralized, top-down uniformity. The workers must learn that not only must their social liberation be their own work, but that liberation is possible only if they themselves attend to the constructive preliminaries instead of leaving the task to the politicians, who are in no way fitted for it. Above all, they must not tie up these efforts with the interests of the nation-states, as has unfortunately happened in most countries hitherto. The world of organized labor must pursue its own ends, as it has its own interests to defend, and these are not identical with the state or of those of the possessing classes. As long as the worker ties up their interests with those of the elites of their country, instead of with those of their class, they must logically also take in their stride all the results of that relationship. They must stand ready to fight the wars of the possessing classes for the retention and extension of their markets, and to defend any injustice they may perpetrate on other peoples. The socialist press of Germany was merely being consistent when at the time of the First World War they urged the annexation of foreign territory. This was merely the inevitable result of the intellectual attitude and the methods which the political labor parties had pursued for a long time before the war. This is something I dislike a lot about representative systems. If you spend enough time in such close proximity as those in parliaments and in Congress do, people with different political views end up resembling each other more and more. Now, centrists will tell you this is a good thing, that this is one of the upsides of representative democracy, and certainly whenever a right-wing party has been moved towards the center as a result of this happening, that's a good thing, obviously. But the same thing happens in the other direction. I would argue it happens more that way, though the overall effect is centrism coming out on top more often than not. And the downside of this is not just left-of-center parties being influenced by right-wing parties, it's also socialist parties as well. People in socialist political parties are inevitably going to spend enormous amounts of time working in close proximity with liberals, to the degree that folks from a movement that used to be explicitly and very strongly opposed to militarism would eventually support one of the most brutal, disgusting, dunderheaded and pointless wars of imperialism in history. From rejection of all imperialist war to support of World War I. As a historian, I cannot even begin to describe how much of a shift that is. It's deeply shameful in my opinion. Rocker ends the chapter with a sort of segue into the next one. He states that an anarcho-syndicalist society would be an alliance of free groups of men and women based on cooperative labor and a planned administration of things in the interests of the community. To prepare the toiling masses in city and country for this great goal and to bind them together as a militant force is the objective of modern anarcho-syndicalism, and in this, its whole purpose is exhausted. Alright, let's move now to Chapter 5, The Methods of Anarcho-Syndicalism. One of the most important points Rocker makes throughout this chapter is that anarcho-syndicalism is an ideology based in pragmatism and is not utopian at all. We are not just sitting around waiting until conditions are such that an anarcho-syndicalist society can be created. Anarcho-syndicalists are out in the community, engaging in all manner of activism and community aid programs. They by no means rest content with the ideal of a future society without lordship. Their efforts are also directed, even today, at restricting the activities of the state and blocking its influence in every department of social life wherever they see an opportunity. It is these tactics which mark off anarcho-syndicalist procedure from the aims and methods of the political labor parties, all of whose activities can tend to constantly broaden the sphere of influence of the political power of the state and to extend it in ever-increasing measure over the economic life of society. This is not to say that ansyn people never support any parliamentary reform-based progress. We do. We are just very thoughtful and considered about what we support and what we don't, and we try to be mindful of what the long-term results of short-term policies may be. The judicial and legislative systems of liberal democracy would not exist in an anarcho-syndicalist society, but that doesn't mean we think it's never a good idea to work within said current systems if you can do so for the genuine betterment of society. For me, this is one of the clear advantages radical left-wing ideologies have over liberalism. We aren't opposed to using liberal methods, but we also have a whole other type of methodology that liberals by and large reject: direct action, which is what the majority of this chapter is about. And this doesn't just apply to state power, it applies to the power of the capitalist class as well. While anarcho-syndicalist efforts are directed at abolishing the existing form of capitalist exploitation and replacing it with a socialist order, they never for a moment forget to work also by every means at their command to lower the rate of profit of the capitalists under existing conditions, and to raise the producers' share of the products of their labor to the highest possible. They do not at all overlook that the efforts of the worker within the existing political order must always be directed toward defending all achieved political and social rights against every attack from reactionaries, constantly widening the scope of these rights wherever the opportunity for this presents itself. Next, Rocker makes a really important point. While anarcho-syndicalists are willing to undertake reform-based efforts that will likely involve legislation being passed, it is a grave mistake to view the legislative aspect as the focal point of the work. The real work is about mobilizing the people and concerting their efforts towards the goal, and once you've achieved this and sustained it for as long as is needed, the resistance to the change being put up by the elites and the other enforcers of the status quo will crumble, and it is at this point that legislation is passed. What that means is, the legislative aspect of progress happens only when said progress has already become inevitable, when the push for the change has become so determined and so loud that it becomes simply unavoidable for the employer class and the political class. As I have previously stated, the work of the people does not end with the legislation either. Only the sustained will of the people will ensure that the government does what it promised the people it would do. What this means is that centering your focus on legislation is looking at things backwards. But the point of attack in the political struggle lies not in the legislative bodies, but in the people. Political rights do not originate in parliaments. They are rather forced on parliaments from without, and even their enactment into law has for a long time been no guarantee of their security. Just as the employers always try to nullify every concession they made to labor as soon as opportunity offered, as soon as any signs of weakness were observable in the workers' organizations, so governments also are always inclined to restrict or to abrogate completely rights and freedoms that have been achieved if they imagine that the people will put up no resistance. Even in these countries where such things as freedom of the press, right of assembly, right of combination, and the like have long existed, governments are constantly trying to restrict these rights, or to reinterpret them by judicial hair-splitting. Political rights do not exist because they have been legally set down on a piece of paper, but only when they have become the ingrown habit of a people, and when any attempt to impair them will meet with the violent resistance of the populace. And now Rocker brings up something which has certainly been extremely important to my worldview, but also to that of most other anarchists. One need only study the history of the past 300 years to understand by what relentless struggles every right has to be wrested inch by inch from the despots. I really do think that a good working knowledge of the history of the labor movement and other progressive movements like civil rights, feminism, and LGBTQ rights is really crucial in terms of what I understand the kids these days call getting woke. With all these movements, there has been a sort of liberal revisionism that has gone on in the education system, to wit the crucial role of direct action tactics is erased, and the popular perception becomes a myth that previous activist movements achieved their objectives through protest marches and civil disobedience alone. And it becomes widely thought by most people that it was liberals who spearheaded these movements and made up the bulk of their ranks. But if you actually look into it, that's not really the case. When Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, it wasn't just racial minority rights he was advocating. He was a socialist. The night he was murdered, he had given a speech about class struggle.
When the slaves get together, that's the beginning of getting out of slavery. Now let us maintain unity. Secondly, let us keep the issues where they are. The issue is injustice. The issue is the refusal of Memphis to be fair and honest in its dealings with its public servants who happen to be sanitation workers.
The mainstream perception of him is that he was a liberal who denounced rioting and all violence, when the truth was not that simple at all. The labor movement was dominated by socialists. Most of its accomplishments came about through direct action tactics. But you wouldn't know that if you're just going by what you were taught in school. I mean, just look at the near deification of Franklin Delano Roosevelt by modern liberals. Many of the American labor movement's achievements have been retroactively attributed to him, when in reality he opposed the labor movement every step of the way, only enacting the progressive policies that he is known for when backed into a corner. He did what he did to save capitalism from the labor movement. He was caving in to their demands. When you think about it, it's kind of sick that the achievements of a mass movement of millions of workers has been retroactively attributed to a single multi-millionaire head of state. It's also quite telling in terms of the way that authoritarian indoctrination operates. Historically, the radical element of the feminist movement was always the part that drove it forward and made it reach for ever more ambitious goals. Of course, the goal of third-wave feminism is nothing short of full gender equality, so there really are no goals that are more ambitious. And as a result, what the term radical feminist has come to mean and to represent has entirely changed now, and these days it is basically synonymous with reactionaries. But the leftist radicals within the first wave were talking about stuff that wouldn't become mainstream in feminism until the second wave, and radicals in the second wave were talking about stuff that wouldn't become mainstream in feminism until the third wave. Anyway, my point is, radicals drive the march towards progressive change, and it is only with a solid understanding of the history of labor and other leftist movements that you can truly understand and appreciate that fact. If anarcho-syndicalists reject participation in the work of parliaments, it is not because they have no sympathy with political struggles in general, but because they are firmly convinced that parliamentary activity is, for the workers, the very weakest and most hopeless form of the political struggle. And because, as I pointed out before, by the time the legislature gets involved, the change has by that point become inevitable. Like with strike actions, as I said, with those, the people don't even need to contact the representatives at all. The employer class will do that for them, and they are more convincing to a political elite than a constituent is anyway. Anyway, what Rocker is criticizing here is not when you engage with parliamentary activism at the end of a process of mass activism that has become impossible for the elites to resist. What he's criticizing is parliamentary activism being attempted as the first step of an activist process, as the main avenue of work. Because when it comes to securing and maintaining the rights of the people, going straight for parliamentary activism is at worst a completely pointless waste of time, or at best slower and less effective than mass mobilization and direct action. For the elite classes, the parliamentary system is without a doubt an appropriate instrument for the settlement of such conflicts as arise, and for making profitable collaboration possible, as they are all equally interested in maintaining the existing economic order and the political organization for the protection of that order. But for the working class, the situation is very different. For them, the existing economic order is the source of their economic exploitation, and the organized power of the state the instrument of their political and social subjection. Even the freest ballot cannot do away with the glaring contrast between the possessing and non-possessing classes in society. It can only serve to impart to a system of social injustice the stamp of legal right, and to induce the slave to set the stamp of legality on his own servitude. Parliamentary participation has not brought the workers one iota nearer to their final goal. It has even prevented them from protecting the rights they have won against the attacks of the reactionaries. Rocker then gives an example of this happening by referencing the coup d'etat of the Prussian ministry by the German Chancellor Franz von Papen. The Social Democrats had control of the Prussian ministry at the time, and the SPD was one of the strongest parties in Germany. Von Papen was able to seize control of the Prussian ministry, then dissolve it, with only a lieutenant and a dozen soldiers. When the Socialist Party in its helplessness could think of nothing to do after this open breach of the constitution except to appeal to the High Court of the Reich instead of meeting the perpetrators of the coup d'etat with open resistance, the reactionaries knew they had nothing more to fear, and from then on could offer the workers what they pleased. The fact is that von Papen's coup d'etat was the start along the road to the Third Reich. And this is why it mattered so much that the First International ended up driving the majority of the socialist movement towards dedicating themselves to parliamentary action, because they lost half the tools in their toolbox, and different tasks require different tools. Hence, anarcho-syndicalism has in its toolbox all manner of different tools, different approaches, different tactics and methods, and the most important ones come under the banner of direct action. Anarcho-syndicalists, then, are not in any way opposed to the political struggle, but in their opinion this struggle must take the form of direct action, in which the instruments of economic power which the working class has at its command are the most effective. The most trivial wage fight shows clearly that whenever the employers find themselves in difficulties, the state steps in with the police, and even in some cases with the militia. By militia, Rocker means outfits like the National Guard in the US. to protect the threatened interests of the possessing classes. It would, therefore, be absurd for them to overlook the importance of the political struggle. Every event that affects the life of the community is of a political nature. In this sense, every important economic action, such for example as a general strike, is also a political action, and moreover one of incomparably greater importance than any parliamentary proceeding. In Russia, it was the great general strike of the working people that in 1905 pressed the pen into the Tsar's hand for the signing of the Constitution. What the heroic struggle of the Russian left-wing intellectuals had not been able to accomplish in decades, the united economic action of the working classes quickly brought to fulfillment. Rocker then argues that it has long been well understood, even by the elites, that direct action is the most effective method when you really need to get stuff done. As an example, he brings up actions undertaken in the European monarchies by the aristocracy against the crown. When they really wanted to change society, they would undertake such actions as refusal to pay taxes to the crown, boycotting products from a particular power, and ultimately even revolution. You can see all three of these in the actions of the American founding fathers. Rocker then points out that it's almost ironic that the elites of the societies created through the use of direct action tactics, like the United States, have since turned around and denounced the use of direct action by the people today. So much the worse if its representatives of today have forgotten the story of their fathers, and how bloody murder at the unlawful methods of the workers fighting for liberation, as if the law had ever permitted a subject class to shake off its yoke. I mean, how much fire can you pack into one sentence? And he's totally right, of course. The United States is a perfect example. The Founding Fathers advocated and engaged in a series of increasingly illegal actions in order to get what they wanted, because they understood very well that that was how to achieve their objective of creating a better society. Then they turned around and proclaimed to the people of their new society that the only acceptable methods of progress was through the lawful electoral process. Then they made sure their education system reinforced this message. This wasn't an accident either. They did this because they knew they could lose their power if the people engaged in the same actions they did against the British. They, as elites, sought to maintain their position as the dominant force in society, so they engaged in barefaced hypocrisy, as do all those who wield the reins of centralized political power. Do as we say, not as we do, is their mantra. Rocker now gets into the nitty-gritty of the direct action tactics advocated by anarcho-syndicalists. He misses one important thing out, which I will get to shortly, but other than that, this section of the book is really good for understanding the nuts and bolts of ansyn tactics. First, he lists them off. By direct action, the anarcho-syndicalists mean every method of immediate warfare by the workers against their economic and political oppressors. Among these, the outstanding are the strike, in all its gradations from the simple wage struggle to the general strike, the boycott, sabotage in its countless forms, anti-war propaganda, and in particularly critical cases, such for example as that in Spain today, armed resistance of the people for the protection of life and liberty. When this book was written, propaganda had a different meaning than it does today. A similar meaning, but with one crucial difference. When we think of propaganda today, we think of material seeking to convince people of a political point or something similar, which is what propaganda meant in Rocker's time. But we add an additional criteria to it that people in his time did not. For us, propaganda also means that the information is false in some way, or at the very least, misleading. It basically means political misinformation. But in Rocker's time, this aspect of the meaning wasn't there. So when he says anti-war propaganda, he is talking about informational material given out en masse with an anti-war message, not something that is trying to impart misinformation. An example I'd give of what he is talking about is another thing Martin Luther King Jr. was doing shortly before he was assassinated, that being telling black men to resist the draft and refuse to fight in the Vietnam War.
As I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. I have tried to offer them my deepest compassion while maintaining my conviction that social change comes most meaningfully through nonviolent action. But they ask, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? They ask if our home nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problem, to bring about the changes it wanted. Their questions hit home, and I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. These are revolutionary times all over the globe. Men are revolting against old systems of exploitation and oppression. And out of the wombs of a frail world, new systems of justice and equality are being born. We in the West must support these revolutions. It is a sad fact that because of comfort, complacency, a morbid fear of communism, and our proneness to adjust to injustice, the Western nations that initiated so much of the revolutionary spirit of the modern world have now become the arch anti-revolutionaries. This has driven many to feel that only Marxism has a revolutionary spirit. Therefore, communism is a judgment against our failure to make democracy real and follow through on the revolutions that we initiated.
MLK wasn't lying to anyone in those speeches, he wasn't trying to mislead anyone, but he was trying to convince his listeners of a political point. It was information and rhetoric of an explicitly political nature with a specific agenda. Therefore, what he was doing would have been called anti-war propaganda in Rocker's time, even though people today might not think of it as such because it contained no lies. Okay, back to Rocker. Among these fighting techniques, the strike, that is, organized refusal to work, is the most used. It plays, in the industrial age, the same role for the workers as did the frequent uprisings of the peasants in the feudal era. In its simplest form, it is for the workers an indispensable means of raising their standard of living, or defending their attained advantages against the concerted measures of the employers. But the strike is, for the workers, not only a means for the defense of immediate economic interests, it is also a continuous schooling for their powers of resistance, showing them every day that every least right has to be won by unceasing struggle against the existing system.
As of right now, we're all on strike. Yeah! Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. Remember, in unity there is strength. So be strong.
Rocker then talks about how, by improving their living standards, people also better position themselves to take in and contribute to the cultural and intellectual development of their society. When you're constantly concerned with where your next meal is coming from or how you will pay this week's rent, you cannot engage with that in a fulfilling way because your attentions are elsewhere. Then Rocker argues that the elites seek to keep the workers distracted from intellectual and cultural pursuits because through engagement with cultural and intellectual works and activities, the masses will be exposed to material that is critical of social injustices and inequality. In short, the interests of the elites are best served when the people are distracted from trying to better their circumstances. When so-called agitators start rousing the people to action through compelling argument and evidence, the workers get aspirations. But it is just these aspirations of the workers which the employers view with deepest distrust. For capitalists as a class, the well-known saying of the Spanish minister Juan Bravo Murillo still holds true today. We need no men who can think among the workers. What we need is beasts of toil. Rocker then argues that 2 centuries of the labor movement has created a natural sense of solidarity among many, if not most, workers, that manifests as instinctive mistrust of elites and a natural sense of empathy towards the plight of workers, including those in other areas or industries who are being exploited. And he goes on to say, to cherish and strengthen this natural solidarity of the workers, and to give every strike movement a more profoundly social character, is one of the most important tasks which the anarcho-syndicalists have set themselves. For this reason, the sympathetic strike is one of their choicest weapons. Through it, the economic battle becomes a deliberate action of the workers as a class. The sympathetic strike is the collaboration of related but also unrelated categories of labor to help the battle of a particular trade to victory by extending the strike to other branches of labor where this is necessary, to make their demands effective. Rocker then talks about the dangers of big mergers and acquisitions in the creation of monopolies, and how, because of the internal transformation in industrial capitalism, the sympathetic strike becomes for the workers the imperative of the hour. Just as the employers are building an ever broader basis for the defense of their interests, so also the workers must turn their attention to creating for themselves an ever wider alliance. So we've gotten to our first specific direct action tactic advocated by anarcho-syndicalists, the sympathetic strike. I think Rocker made it fairly clear what that is, but just in case anyone is unclear, here's an example. Workers in a fast food chain operating in, say, Washington State go on strike because they haven't had a pay increase in years and are on poverty wages. If the strike isn't going well and the employers are holding out, workers in another fast food chain that operates in Washington State would then also go on strike. If the employers of food chain A still hold out, workers at, say, a grocery store chain, or really any other field of work in Washington State, might then join the strike as well. One potential result of this is the local politicians and representatives of Washington State in the House and Senate putting pressure on the employers of fast food chain A, because of pressure being put on them by fast food chain B and the grocery store chain, etc. And of course, fast food chain B and the grocery store will also be exerting pressure on fast food chain A directly to just cave already so everyone can move on with their lives and get back to business. Remember the anarcho-syndicalist labor cartels we talked about in the previous chapter, federations of unions of any and all industries within a geographical area. Well, as you can probably imagine, sympathetic strikes become very easy to organize and sustain if that area has such a labor cartel. In this situation, they become a very potent weapon because of how swiftly they can be organized and how often they can be carried out. And the different unions in the labor cartel can take turns doing such strike, so no single union is overburdened by the experience. Think about how quickly that kind of federation could implement sympathetic strikes and how effectively they could move cartel resources around to help each union conducting such a strike. And Rocker also pointed out a variation of the sympathetic strike that applies to businesses under the umbrella of a large conglomerate. Say one such large corporation owns fast food chain A and the grocery store. Then the situation becomes such that the higher-ups within the grocery store business are lobbying their superiors in the conglomerate, which in turn exerts pressure on fast food chain A to give in to the workers' demands. So, as you can see, in the age of giant multinationals owning dozens or even hundreds of individual businesses, the sympathetic strike is an extremely useful tactic. Now we get to what is the single most important and most effective tactic, the general strike. Direct action by organized labor finds its strongest expression in the general strike, in the stoppage of work in every branch of production by the organized resistance of the proletariat, with all the consequences arising from it. It is the most powerful weapon which the workers have at their command, and gives the most comprehensive expression to their strength as a social factor. A general strike is when unions of workers in an industry or group of related or unrelated industries all go on strike simultaneously across a country. These are done not to improve working conditions or wages at any particular specific workplace, but to force the state or capitalists within a specific industry or industries to either undertake or not undertake a particular action. The goal of the general strike is essentially to temporarily hinder the entire society's ability to function in order to put as much pressure as possible onto the target elites. For this reason, usually specific industries have a prominent role in general strikes. Industries that, if crippled, can basically shut down a country for the duration of the strike action. Industries like transportation and energy. If nobody can get to work and cargo cannot be moved around, the elites are forced to pay attention. If there's no electricity, same thing. With the sympathetic strikes, I mentioned how useful the existence of a labor cartel in the relevant area would be. Well, for a general strike, it's the same thing, but with the other type of trade union federation used by anarcho-syndicalists, the Industrial Alliance. If workers in different industries within Wellington wanted to go on sympathetic strikes, the Wellington labor cartel would make it much easier to coordinate and supply the striking workers. But if all the workers in the transportation industry wanted to go on a general strike across New Zealand, the New Zealand Transportation Alliance could facilitate and coordinate that. So not only does this dual system of organization along industrial and geographical lines serve as a great way to structure an anarchist society and facilitate the direct democracy such a society would require, it also serves as a great way to organize workers within the existing system. And I'm sure I don't have to point out that it would also be a great way to organize and conduct a social revolution, to coordinate but not coerce the actions of vast numbers of workers in seizing control of the means of production. The general strike is, of course, not an agency that can be invoked arbitrarily on every occasion. It needs certain assumptions to give it its proper moral strength and to make it a proclamation of the will of the broad masses of the people. The ridiculous claim, which is so often attributed to the anarcho-syndicalists, that it is only necessary to proclaim a general strike in order to achieve a socialist society in a few days, is of course just a silly invention of evil-minded opponents bent on discrediting an idea which they cannot attack by other means. Regarding the second part of what Rocker says here, Rocker's correct. No anarcho-syndicalist thinks a single short general strike could bring about socialism. As I mentioned before, the anarcho-syndicalist model for social revolution does, however, involve a series of increasingly drawn-out and crippling general strikes, with the final one, the longest and most desperate of all, ending with an armed mass uprising. Regarding the first part, this is something that is of utmost importance to the utility of the general strike as a tactic. Because it is by far the most severe of all effective direct action tactics, it also must be the most rarely and carefully used. The most important thing is that the right issues are chosen. If you do a general strike for an issue that is not of grave enough importance, the people will be against you. Because you are essentially shutting down society's ability to correctly function, the people are going to be just as negatively affected by this as the elites are. Therefore, the people must understand why it is being done, and why it is important enough for them to accept that sacrifice. Also, if the people are on your side, various other kinds of mass movements will also be in motion, adding to the pressure on the elites. And this is where the general strike really shines, as the final push in a multifaceted popular campaign around the relevant issue. It matters enormously what issue the general strike is being conducted in response to or because of. Let me give you a couple of examples. The series of general strikes that occurred in France in 1995 and the series of general strikes that occurred in France in 2007. In 1995, a new right-wing coalition government had been elected. They proposed a plan to reduce the budget deficit by slashing welfare, a move that would have a big negative impact on millions of French people. The general strikes were planned, and polls showed that the people were on the side of the unions. A student movement sprang up around the issue, and people were in the streets. The newly emerging third-wave feminist movement in France were galvanized by this as well, as the welfare cutbacks involved a misogynistic reduction in services, specifically for women. You can see how this was clearly something that had both support from the general population and also simultaneous related activist movements. Different groups were active on the issue, and it had the people's attention. This was an ideal basis for a general strike, and thus in October the first of the strikes was conducted. Then more general strikes followed later in October and in November, chipping away at the state's resolve. And finally, a very effective general strike centered around railway workers forced them to finally cave, and the welfare cutbacks plan was abandoned. Compare that to 2007, which was also an election year. New Conservative President Nicolas Sarkozy announced plans to cut early retirement benefits for 500,000 public sector workers. Now, I'm not saying that this isn't obviously an important cause. The state was being Darth Vader at the end of empire.
I am altering the deal. Pray I don't alter it any further.
500,000 people is a lot, and early retirement options matter, but I think it is fair to say that this is not at the same level of dire urgency as millions of the poorest people in France having their already meagre welfare slashed in a very heavy-handed and callous manner. So the people were not on the side of the strikers this time, and they failed to gather the momentum they required. The strikers did engage in talks with the government, but did not achieve what they set out to. So yes, Rocker was wise to point out that general strikes must be used sparingly and wisely. Rocker then describes a variety of different ways in which general strikes can be used. The general strike can serve various purposes. It can be the last stage of a sympathetic strike, as for example the general strike in Barcelona in February 1902, or that in Bilbao in October 1903, which enabled the mine workers to get rid of the hated truck system and compelled the employers to establish sanitary conditions on the mines. It can as easily be a means by which organized labor tries to enforce some general demand, as for example in the attempted general strike in the USA in 1886, to compel the granting of the 8-hour day in all industries. The Great General Strike of the English workers in 1926 was the result of a planned attempt by the employers to lower the general standard of living of the workers by a cut in wages. But the general strike can also have political objectives in view, as for example in the fight of the Spanish workers in 1904 for the liberation of political prisoners, or the general strike in Catalonia in July 1909 to compel the government to terminate the war in Morocco. He goes on to list a bunch more examples of general strikes being used to achieve political goals. Then he talks in a bit more detail about the function served by general strikes and the effect they have. The great importance of the general strike lies in this. At one blow, it brings the whole economic system to a standstill and shakes it to its foundations. That the organized workers in the most important industries stop work is enough to cripple the entire economic mechanism, which cannot function without the daily provision of coal, electric power, and raw materials of every sort. But when the ruling classes are confronted with an energetic, organized working class, schooled in daily conflict, and are aware of what they have at stake, they become much more willing to make the necessary concessions, and above all, they fear to take a course with the workers which might drive them to extremes. By crippling the whole public life, it makes difficult mutual agreements of the representatives of the ruling classes and the local officials with the central government, even when it does not entirely prevent them. As I said before, the purpose of the general strike is to make it difficult for the elites, those who control society, to conduct their operations. Now Rocker brings up something worth mentioning when it comes to general strikes and other large-scale forms of mass direct action: the possibility that the state may use the military or National Guard-type internal forces to attempt to compel the workers to submit. And he argues that this potential option is an unwise one for the state to use. Where the military faces a determined people fighting for its freedom, there always exists the possibility that at least a part of the soldiers will reach some inner insight and comprehend that after all, it is their own parents and brothers at whom they are pointing their weapons. The proper beginning of the Syrian civil war is generally said to have been when, after Assad sent the military to quell unrest in urban centers, scores of military units defected to the newly arisen rebel factions and declared war on the Syrian state. Not only did sending the military in result in more civilians joining the rebels in reaction to the heavy-handed use of force by the state, but it also resulted in big chunks of the military itself becoming core units within the rebel forces. And of course, this is far from the only example. In almost all revolutions, defecting army units are integral to the tide turning away from the regime in power. In looking at these situations from the perspective of the soldiers, it is easy to see why they would defect, even those who previously had no inclination away from being a thug for state power. They are being asked, after all, to kill their own people, and they are seeing their fellow soldiers doing just that. I can see why even the most indoctrinated, bloodthirsty grunt would refuse to take part in that. It makes sense that they would see that there are higher tasks in life than lending oneself to the uses of a bloody oppressor of one's own people. And the last thing I wanted to mention from Rocker's discussion of general strikes is a reference he makes to a novel. William Morris, with the prophetic vision of the poet, foresaw this development in affairs when, in his splendid book News from Nowhere, he has the socialist reconstruction of society preceded by a long series of general strikes, of ever-increasing violence, which shook the old system to its deepest foundations, until at last its supporters were no longer able to put up any resistance against this new enlightenment of the toiling masses in town and country. News from Nowhere was published in 1890 and depicts a utopian socialist society. Socialist, but not communist, since patriarchy remains intact, and therefore a class system still exists, based around gender. This is because the author, textile designer and socialist activist William Morris, had gender politics typical of his era. In other words, he was a raging misogynist. But anyway, the reason I brought this up is probably obvious, that the revolution described in the novel is one based on general strikes, what would become the anarcho-syndicalist revolutionary model. Another form of direct action is the social strike. It is concerned less with the immediate interests of the producers than with the protection of the community against the most pernicious outgrowths of the present system. The social strike seeks to force upon the employers a responsibility to the public. Primarily, it has in its view the protection of the consumers, of whom the workers themselves constitute the great majority. Rocker then provides examples, such as the strike of the building workers in Barcelona, who refused to use poor materials and the wreckage from old buildings in the erection of workers' dwellings, 1902. The strikes in various large restaurants in Paris because the kitchen workers were unwilling to prepare for serving cheap, decaying meat, 1906. I don't have much to say about social strikes in particular, but I do want to take this opportunity to talk about something syndicalists think is extremely important about unions, that being the role they play in getting involved in issues outside their specific worker rights-based role, the intersectional stuff that unions do, their capability and tendency to support other groups in time of need and stand together with the marginalized and brutalized. That's part of why syndicalists love unions as much as we do. Community solidarity, standing up for what is right and what matters, being united and supportive of those who need unity and support.
There's power in a factory, power in the line.
I mentioned before that Rocker misses out one important direct action tactic favored by anarcho-syndicalists, and that's what I'd like to talk about now, that being the wildcat strike. You may have noticed that there is a bit of a cat theme among the imagery used by anarcho-syndicalists to represent direct action tactics. There's the general strike cat, which I showed before. Then there's the direct action cat. But the most popular one, which I use in my crest, is called the sabot cat. It represents two key direct action tactics favored by anarcho-syndicalists, one being industrial sabotage, which we will get to soon, and the other being the wildcat strike. When a group of workers in a union petition the union overall to go on strike due to something that is affecting them, and the union as a whole decides against going on strike, a wildcat strike is when that group of workers goes on strike anyway, against the wishes of the union at large. This was a tactic famously used to great effect during the 1968 civil unrest in France. There were also a series of important wildcat strikes in the US that same year. Wildcat strikes also played a role in the lead-up to the Russian Revolution. Wildcat strikes are especially crucial in countries where the unions are extremely centralized, like the example that Rocker gave earlier of how centralization crippled the union's ability to act in the Weimar Republic. The Wikipedia article on wildcat strikes also mentions that in Vietnam, all legal unions are required to be part of a centralized body called the Vietnam General Confederation of Labor, and due to the fact that this is widely thought of by the workers as being much too close to the elites, wildcat strikes are the dominant form of strike action in that country. And the last thing I will say about wildcat strikes is that one thing that often happens with them is that witnessing fellow workers refusing to back down and taking action no matter what can galvanize the rest of the union into seeing the light and joining with and officially endorsing the strike, meaning it's not a wildcat action anymore. So there have been a number of big strikes that began as wildcats. Okay, back to Rocker. Another important fighting device for direct action is the boycott. It can be employed by the workers both in their character of producers and of consumers. A systematic refusal of consumers to buy from firms that handle goods not produced under conditions approved by the labor unions can often be of decisive importance, especially for those branches of labor engaged in the production of commodities of general use. At the same time, the boycott is very well adapted to influencing public opinion in favor of the workers, provided it is accompanied by suitable propaganda. The union label is an effective means of facilitating the boycott, as it gives the purchaser the sign by which to distinguish the goods he wants from the spurious. And I just got to restate that when Rocker says propaganda, he is just talking about information with a political agenda behind it. He's not talking about telling lies and misleading people. Rocker then gives an example of a boycott from what was recent times for him. But since that's 80 years ago for us, I figured I'd go with a slightly more recent example. In South Africa, apartheid ended in practice in the early 1990s, in either 1990 or 1991 depending on which specific event you go by, and it ended officially with the 1994 general election. There were many different factors which contributed to it ending, but one of the biggest was multiple international boycotts. The first boycott was in the realm of international sport, when the International Cricket Conference, which was the governing body of international cricket, imposed a moratorium on tours by the South African cricket team and on other teams going to South Africa. Then the following year, the South African rugby team toured Australia, and it led to a large-scale anti-apartheid protest movement mobilizing against the tour. 10 years later, in 1981, the South African rugby team toured New Zealand, and the same thing happened again, with one of the largest and most militant protest movements in the history of the country having street battles with riot police in at least 4 cities. And boycotts in other sports emerged as well, like when Greece banned them from participating in a golf tournament in Athens. In fact, there were a whole swathe of boycott movements against South African sports teams touring and participating in international sporting tournaments and events that remained in place until the end of apartheid for many kinds of different sports. This became a public relations nightmare for the South African government, and it led to the next step in the international campaign against apartheid, a huge international boycott of all products manufactured in South Africa. And it lasted for years. The global left was admirably united in the boycott, and it was devastating for the South African economy. This is a complex international example, but the boycott can also be used in local labor disputes, and be targeted much more specifically, say the products or services of a specific corporation. An example of this can be seen today in the movement to boycott Amazon products. At both the local labor dispute level and the full-on global geopolitical level, boycotts can be extremely effective. Now Rocker moves on to the next tactic in the list, Among the weapons in the anarcho-syndicalist armory, sabotage is the one most feared by the employer and most harshly condemned as unlawful. In reality, we are dealing here with a method of economic small-scale warfare that is as old as the system of exploitation and political oppression itself. It is, in some circumstances, simply forced upon the workers when every other device fails. Sabotage consists in the workers putting every possible obstacle in the way of the ordinary modes of work. The term itself is derived from the French word sabot, wooden shoe, and means to work clumsily as if by sabot blows, i.e. using a clog instead of a hammer to bash in a nail. The whole import of sabotage is exhausted in the motto, "For bad wages, bad work." The employer himself acts on the same principle when he calculates the price of his goods according to their quality. The producer finds himself in the same position. His goods are his labor power, and it is only good and proper that he should try to dispose of it in the best terms he can get. Industrial sabotage is different from other forms of sabotage, like the military kind. With acts of military sabotage, the aim is usually to create faulty products without alerting the overseers that you are doing so. So you don't want to disrupt the lines of production because that would let the powers that be know what's going on. Rather, you compromise the usability of the war material that is being created in ways that will only be revealed at the moment of failure. An example of this can be seen in the sabotage of V2 rockets being produced at the German Army Research Center in Peenemünde. Typically, with industrial sabotage, the goal is the opposite of this, because keeping production going and thus keeping the products being sold at market and generating profit for the bosses while creating faulty products that will harm the consumers is the last thing wanted by those engaging in industrial sabotage. Anarcho-syndicalists advocate both these forms of sabotage, though obviously military sabotage applies only to those working in factories producing military hardware and equipment, and usually only in a time of war. So for the purposes of this discussion, all mentions of sabotage will be referring to the industrial kind. That being when workers take action to disrupt the lines of production and either slow down or put a halt to the work. Everything from just working slowly and poorly to outright throwing a wrench into the machine, the latter usually being done in such a way that the bosses won't be able to know exactly who did it. The scale of the sabotage should match the scale of the issue. Are workers' demands for a living wage being ignored? Then they shouldn't be doing the best work they can. Are they having already subpar benefits gutted or being laid off with no recourse? Then perhaps something a bit more impactful is called for. Is the company involved in extremely unethical behavior and seriously hurting the community? Then shut down the whole factory.
Shut it down. Shut it down now.
For example, if it is discovered that a factory is leaking pollutants into a river that a community relies on, killing fish, damaging the ecosystem, and poisoning nearby people. In that case, workers in the factory might just consider it their moral duty to cause enough sabotage to completely halt all production. Like the general strike, sabotage is a tool best reserved for special circumstances, brought into play only when it counts, used too often or for the wrong purpose, and its utility as a tactic is diminished. But when the employer takes advantage of the position of the producer to force the price of his labor power as low as possible, he need not wonder when the latter defends himself as best he can, and for this purpose makes use of the means which the circumstances put in his hands. The English workers were already doing this long before revolutionary syndicalism was spoken of on the continent. In fact, the policy of car canny, go slow, which along with the phrase itself the English workers took over from their Scottish brethren, was the first and most effective form of sabotage. There are today in every industry 100 means by which the workers can seriously disturb production. Everywhere under the modern system of division of labor, where often the slightest disturbance in one branch of work can bring to a standstill the entire process of production. So, for example, every phase of an assembly line production system has equal potential to, screw up the whole process. That's kind of how assembly lines work. Rocker then goes on to provide some examples of industrial sabotage happening in France and Italy. But I think the point here is made without them, and Rocker ends the discussion of sabotage by talking about the link between sabotage actions and strike actions. The so-called sit-down strike, which was transplanted from Europe to America with such surprising rapidity, and consists of the workers remaining in the plant day and night without turning a finger in order to prevent the installing of strike breakers, belongs in the realm of sabotage. Very often sabotage works thus. Before a strike, the workers put the machines out of order to make the work of possible strike breakers harder, or even impossible for a considerable time. But the sabotage of the workers is directed against the employers, never against the consumers. consumers. In his report before the CGT in Toulouse in 1897, Émile Pouget laid special stress on this point. All the reports in the bourgeois press about bakers who had baked glass in their bread or farmhands who had poisoned milk and the like are malicious inventions designed solely to prejudice the public against the workers. As I said, causing faulty and harmful products to end up being sold to consumers is never the goal of competent industrial sabotage. Proper sabotage results in products either being created at a slower rate or not at all. That's not the same as intentionally manufacturing harmful products, which in fact is a reason why sabotage might be carried out, to stop production of such products, and not a methodology of legitimate sabotage. On the subject of sit-down strikes, I'd like to spend a bit of time talking about what I think is one of the most interesting labour actions of the last 40 years or so, the Rixon factory sit-down strike in Levin, New Zealand, 1981. A clothing factory in the town of Levin, the employees of which were almost all women, were told by the factory owner that he had decided to sell the factory, and that they would all be losing their jobs within the next few days. They then discovered through their union that they would not be getting any redundancy pay. The women talked about the situation, then made their boss an offer. They could pool their resources, buy the factory together, and run it as a self-managed cooperative. He refused this offer. New Zealand employment law at this time wasn't great, so there was no legal recourse they could go for, leaving them no choice but to use direct action. They decided on a sit-down strike. It was only the second sit-down strike in the history of New Zealand, and the first one had only lasted 6 hours, so it doesn't really count. So these women occupied the factory 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The strike began quite crudely, but quickly became fairly sophisticated, with women living in the factory in shifts. Each worker spent the majority of their time at home, but there was always a good amount of workers in the factory. Their union supported them financially, as did other unions. Even the Clothing Workers Union of Australia sent them money. The Federation of Labour, the largest federation of trade unions in New Zealand, threw in their full support, meeting with the factory owner and threatening him with marches, strikes, and other actions across the entire country if he did not relent. The town then saw the biggest protest march in its history, and workers identified the boss's other factory in a different part of the country, and a protest began outside it. The factory owner then tried to switch off the power to the Rixon factory, but the workers at the local electrical board refused to carry out this request. The union then voted to pay for electricity use at the factory. In the end, the workers won after a 3-month-long sit-in, and the strike became a key event in the later history of the New Zealand labour movement and the second-wave feminist movement in this country. There's a really interesting short documentary about the strike that was made contemporaneously, and it is viewable on Vimeo, link in the description. I encourage you to check it out. One of the interesting things about sit-down strikes that Rocker does not touch on is the effect that living communally can have on the workers. Living together, spending that amount of time together, binds the workers to each other like a unit, a family. A bond forms and only grows stronger over time. One of the hurdles of strike actions in general is that in failed strikes, the group cohesion among the workers breaks down over time. That strong connection that is formed in the early days of a strike, that energy and enthusiasm, can sometimes dissipate over weeks and months.
It's morale. That's the thing. It's just as important as money. We need to keep them up, Mike. Because the minute they start to feel like a lost cause.
But in sit-down strikes, that bond tends to, if anything, grow stronger over time. The workers become very close.
What's it been like living in a factory here?
Well, I must say I'm going to find it hard to leave here now because these are my friends here now, you know. And my really good friends here, we get on really good, and I've enjoyed it here, you know, the good and the bad times.
Rocker focuses on the sabotaging effect that sit-down strikes have, and this is very important. But in my view, the bonding effect that communal living has is just as important. And another important factor about this form of strike is that the workers end up with a lot of time needing to be filled with activity. They are, after all, occupying a space for what is likely to be months on end, and that can end up being very boring.
Spending day after day at the workplace, many women do handcrafts. Some play cards and housey, do crosswords and read the papers. Others have taken up skating to relieve the boredom. Visiting speakers and discussion groups have explored topics ranging from breast cancer to unions.
One of the things you can fill the time up with, though, is radical education, something that, as Rocker makes clear throughout this book, is very important for anarcho-syndicalism and radical unionism in general. You can organize through the union federations to get all kinds of interesting speakers in to give talks, and have group discussions afterwards. This creates kind of a positive feedback loop as well, where the strike makes workers curious about radical politics and direct action, and the radical education reinforces their enthusiasm for and dedication to the strike. Rocker then ends the chapter in typical fashion for this book by alluding to the topic of the next chapter. The great final goal of socialism must emerge from all the practical daily struggles, and must give them a social character. In the smallest struggle, born of the needs of the moment, there must be mirrored the great goal of social liberation, and each such struggle must help smooth the way and strengthen the spirit which transforms the inner longing of its bearers into will and deed. Striving day to day to improve the lives of workers is supremely important, and this is most effectively and most wisely done while also having a well thought out long-term goal and a concrete plan for how to get there, using systems that function well for the realization of both the short-term and long-term goals. Now we move on to Chapter 6, The Evolution of Anarcho-Syndicalism. In this chapter, Rocker gets back to his historical summary, at the point at which he left off, the origins and development of revolutionary syndicalism in France. The idea of the general strike was first brought into the French trade union movement by the anarchist carpenter Tourtellier, who had been deeply stirred by the general strike movement in the USA. Here Rocker makes reference to Joseph Jean-Marie Tourtellier, who once authored a satirical campaign poster, meant to encourage people not to be satisfied with the supposedly democratic meager offerings of a representative system, and to instead rise up and make a better society for themselves. The great strike movements and the countless prosecutions of the CGT by the government merely strengthened their revolutionary verve and caused the new ideas to find their way also into Switzerland, Germany, Italy, Holland, Belgium, Bohemia, and the Scandinavian countries. The influence of French syndicalism on the international labour movement was strengthened in great degree by the internal crisis which at the time laid hold of nearly all the socialist labour parties, the battle between the so-called revisionists and the rigid Marxists. Rocker then provides some information about that, but I'm going to skip it here. Independent of European anarcho-syndicalism, there developed in the USA the movement of the industrial workers of the world, which was wholly the outgrowth of American conditions. Still, it had in common with anarcho-syndicalism the methods of direct action, and the idea of a socialist reorganization of society by the industrial and agricultural organization of the workers themselves. The IWW had an especially strong influence on the itinerant workers in the West, but they also gained some influence among factory workers in the eastern states, and conducted a great many widespread strikes, which put the name of the Wobblies in everybody's mouth. They took an outstanding part in the embittered battles for the safeguarding of freedom of speech in the western states, and made many terrible sacrifices of life and liberty in doing so. Their members filled the jails by thousands. Many were tarred and feathered by fanatical vigilantes, or lynched outright. The Everett Massacre of 1916, the execution of Labour poet Joe Hill in 1915, the Centralia affair in 1919, and a lot of similar cases in which defenseless workers fell victims were only a few milestones in the IWW's history of sacrifice. The IWW today may not be what it once was, but it's still a really great organization that I am proud to be a member of. They do a lot of really good work all over the place, helping workers unionize their workplace and get organized. They are involved in a lot of worker education efforts, both in terms of how to best operate within the existing system and the spreading of radical, mostly anarcho-syndicalist ideas. Rocker now turns to the Soviet Union's interactions with the anarcho-syndicalist movement. In 1919, the Bolshevist Party, which had attained power in Russia, issued an appeal to the revolutionary workers' organizations in the world and invited them to a congress, which was to meet in Russia in the following year to set up a new international. Communist parties existed at that time in only a few countries. On the other hand, there were in Spain, Portugal, Italy, France, Holland, Sweden, Germany, England, and the countries of North and South America, syndicalist organizations, some of which exercised a very strong influence. It was, therefore, of deep concern to Lenin and his followers to win these particular organizations, as he had so thoroughly alienated himself from the socialist labor parties that he could scarcely count on their support. So it came about that at the Congress of the founding of the Third International in the summer of 1920, almost all of the syndicalist and anarcho-syndicalist organizations were represented. But the impressions which the syndicalist delegates received in Russia were not calculated to make them regard collaboration with the communists as either possible or desirable. The dictatorship of the proletariat was already revealing itself in its worst light. The prisons were filled with socialists of every school, among them many anarchists and anarcho-syndicalists. But above all, it was plain that the new dominant caste was in no way fitted for the task of genuine socialist reconstruction. The foundation of the Third International, with its dictatorial apparatus of organization and its effort to make the whole labor movement of Europe into an instrument of the foreign policy of the Bolshevist state, quickly made plain to the syndicalists that there was no place for them in that organization. The Third International was a ridiculous, authoritarian farce, and the anarcho-syndicalist movement of the time rightly wanted nothing to do with it as soon as this had become apparent to them. Next, Rocker talks about the International Congress of Syndicalists that took place in Berlin from late 1922 to early 1923, and he lists each country that sent delegates and how many anarcho-syndicalist workers those delegates represented. He mentions that they founded a new revolutionary syndicalist organization called the International Working Men's Association, so still with the traditional gender role stuff. If another such organization were founded today, it would likely be called simply the International Workers' Association. I mean, they made their name unnecessarily longer, purely to throw some gender traditionalism into it, which is kind of baffling to me. Anyway, the reason I am bringing attention to any of this is a passage that Rocker quotes from the Declaration of Principles drawn up for this new syndicalist organization. Revolutionary syndicalism is the confirmed enemy of every form of economic and social monopoly, and aims at its abolition by means of economic communes and administrative organs of field and factory workers on the basis of a free system of councils, entirely liberated from subordination to any government or political party. Against the politics of the state and of parties, it erects the economic organization of labor. Against the government of men, it sets up the administration of things. Consequently, it has for its object not the conquest of political power, but the abolition of every state function in social life. It considers that, along with the monopoly of property, should disappear also the monopoly of domination, and that any form of the state, including the dictatorship of the proletariat, will always be the creator of new privileges. It could never be an instrument of liberation. The IWMA from then on travelled its own road, and gained a foothold in a number of countries which had not been represented at the founding Congress. Among all the international alliances of organized labor, it is the one that has most faithfully cherished the traditions of the First International, which unfortunately included being blind to the women in the workplace branch of first-wave feminism, which had at this point been active for, only about 60 or 70 years. Rocker then returns to the subject of the CNT and the Spanish Revolution, and while I do have more to say about them, I will save that for my examination of the epilogue and skip most of this part, and on to Rocker's discussion of the situation in Italy around this time, which, given that we are talking about the early 1920s, was obviously not great. When in 1922 the general strike against fascism broke out, the liberal government armed the fascist hordes and throttled this last attempt at the defense of freedom and rights. But Italian democracy had dug its own grave. It thought it could use Mussolini as a tool against the workers, but thus it became its own gravedigger. And while Rocker goes on to discuss the anarcho-syndicalist movements in various other European countries, for the purpose of this sort of video I don't think it's particularly pertinent, so I will end my analysis of this chapter with the following tidbit from Rocker's discussion about France during this period. In 1922, 2 anarcho-syndicalists were shot down by communists in the Paris Trade Union House. This assassination had been sponsored by the Soviet Union as part of a plan to take over a breakaway element of the CGT. I mention this because this is the sort of incident I personally haven't seen referenced that many times. You know, this kind of really gross stuff the Soviet Union was doing in the labor movements of other countries in Europe. Anyway, we now move on to the last part of the book, the epilogue. The epilogue was written in 1947 and added to the second printing of the book. Rocker updates his history from 10 years earlier up to what was then the present day. I'm not going to cover almost any of that, except for what Rocker addresses at the start of the epilogue, the fascist victory in the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish people had to carry on their valiant fight for liberty, human dignity, and social justice almost single-handed, while the whole world passively watched the unequal struggle. The so-called democracies of the West denied the Spaniards the materials so urgently needed in their titanic battle against their relentless foe, and organized labor in Europe and America, demoralized and split up into hostile factions, remained indifferent or helpless when everything in Europe was at stake. They had to pay dearly for their passivity. For with Spain in the hands of Franco, the way was cleared for the Second World War and its terrible results. Even Mr. Sumner Welles, the former Secretary of State of the United States, had to admit that the policy of his country towards Spain in those years of decision was one of the greatest errors America ever committed. I'm going to use this as a jumping-off point to make a rebuttal to an argument I see being made sometimes by state socialists. When I am having discussions or arguments with the various kinds of state socialists, I bring up the point that state socialism can never bring about a socialist society, because it attempts to do so from the top down, and this will always result in some class of elites controlling the means of production instead of the workers. One of the common rebuttals to this is to say that it is unrealistic to hold socialism to such a high standard, as then no society in history would qualify as socialist. But that's not correct. There has been at least one truly socialist society, in revolutionary Catalonia. In response to this, the classic refrain is that this doesn't count because they lost their war with the fascists, which is such a bullshit argument that it honestly pisses me off quite a lot. One of my pet peeves is victim blaming. Arguments based on victim blaming are everywhere in competition-based societies like ours, so I see them all the time, as I'm sure you do too. And that's exactly what this is. The Spanish had almost no international support from either the liberal democracies or the international socialist movement. The anarcho-syndicalists in Catalonia were forced to carry out their existential struggle against the fascists essentially completely alone. Not only were they not aided, they were actively undermined. The Soviet Union opposed them at every step, and given that, the truth is they did remarkably well. It wasn't their fault they didn't have the support they needed. The fascists had plenty of support from Hitler and Mussolini, and among the areas they controlled at the beginning of the conflict were the most mineral-rich regions of Spain. The deck was stacked against the Catalonian anarcho-syndicalists. It's frankly amazing that they did as well as they did. It's a testament to their organizational capabilities, their bravery, and their resolve. And the fact that they operated a truly socialist society while engaging in such a war is astonishing evidence of the worthiness of their ideology and praxis. They present a model that we must learn from in this era. In the last video, I mentioned an aspect of a resolution adopted by the First International that sadly was never widely carried out. At the Congress in Basel in 1869, a resolution was adopted that contained the following sentence: "The Congress directs the General Council to provide for the alliance of the trade unions of all countries." The aim of this was to create a network of trade unions around the world that would over time become more and more sophisticated, to the point where it could be used to covertly move resources around internationally. For example, to support a revolution happening in a specific country. Large amounts of war material, resources, and personnel could be shipped there quickly and in a clandestine manner, ideal for supplying the kinds of guerrilla warfare units most often formed by anarchists, either undertaking revolutionary activity or insurrectionary activity. It is precisely due to the lack of this, and of an international socialist movement willing and able to create this, or just to get off their asses and do anything of substance at all, that the anarcho-syndicalists lost their war with the fascists in Spain. They were the victims of their loss, not the cause of it. They did everything they could, and what they did was really impressive. I would argue that any such war with a force that is being extensively aided by foreign powers is doomed to fail without that kind of sophisticated clandestine network. And I would also argue that an international federation of national trade union federations is the ideal organism to conceal such a network within. Okay, now we have the final excerpt I would like to take from the book. As for the labor movement, Franco's victory paved the way to the worst debacle the workers of Europe ever had to suffer. Under the heel of Hitler's armies, the whole labor movement in Germany, France, Italy, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Holland, Belgium, Norway, and the countries in the southeast of Europe crumbled to dust, and the entire continent was turned into a desert of ruins, starvation, and unspeakable misery. I didn't properly understand and comprehend the sheer level of the horrors that ravaged mainland Europe during World War II until I read a book called Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder. An excellent and informative book, though be warned that it is extremely heavy subject matter, frequently depressing and sometimes outright disturbing. Incidentally, because this book is very critical of Stalin, tankies hate it and will attack any positive mention of it they see, and as is their way, their method of attack is usually to link to Stalinist propaganda sources. You know, like some tanky website or whatever. So in case you see any tankies shit-talking that book, take their criticism with a grain of salt. That's the end of Anarcho-Syndicalism Theory and Practice by Rudolf Rocker. Thank you so much for taking the time and effort to watch these videos. Farewell, comrades and potential comrades, and I shall see you when I take a look at the next book in this series, which will probably be the bread book, but I might decide to cover something else next instead.